Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Beyond Talking Points with Matt and Matt. My co-host and I watched a lecture that Noam Chomsky gave many years back, so far back that the recording is actually a VHS recording. And I think it was titled Critique of Madisonian Democracy. And so basically, in the lecture, Chomsky gives his thoughts on the significance of the American Revolution from the perspective of uh, political theory, political philosophy, political history, and then he goes on to critique it. He goes on to explain, why his criticisms uh, of the American system. He doesn't obviously condemn all of it, but for the most part, he does see it as um, a lot of steps in the wrong direction. Um, and so I guess I thought I would begin by just giving a few sentences about kind of my perspective on the American Revolution. Um, and it might be interesting, or the first thing to note perhaps is it wasn't even much of a revolution. Um, we call it a revolution, of course, because it was technically it was the founding of our country, and it did take a war to for it to be for the conflict to be settled. But it was in many ways a replacement of elites with elites. The question was, do you want British elites or do you want colonial elites? And then the colonists decided, well, we want colonial elites, or at least the colonial elites decided that they wanted to take charge. Whatever the average person thought, it's perhaps a different matter altogether. Um, on the other hand, I think it's safe to say, and Chomsky would go along with this to a degree, that um, the American Revolution was a deviation from a lot of politics before. Um, it was a deviation from everything that had come previously, in the sense that uh, the founding fathers sort of embodied a very specific part, or very specific ideas that came from, I guess you would say, the Age of Enlightenment. Um, so, on the one hand, I perhaps the way to think about it then is a lot of the ideas you could consider revolutionary, but the in terms of the material conditions, not a lot was changed. Um, so that's probably a good a good place to begin. So I'm kind of curious, maybe if what I said gives inspires anything in you. And there's a lot to talk about. Chomsky brings up so much, and we'll cover as much as we can in an hour. But I'll let my co-host jump in here, and we'll go from there.
So one thing that's interesting about Chomsky, at least in everything I've seen of his work, and it's both interesting and frustrating. And I'll qualify this by saying the really the only content by Chomsky I've consumed is the past episode we did on Chomsky, the lecture we watched here, and then I listened to the audiobook of Requiem for an American for the American Dream. But pretty much everything he talks about is through the lens of democracy. And that's partially, I mean, I know he is to some extent a historian and a scholar, so he doesn't necessarily have to view it that way. But a lot of the way he frames things is through that lens. So I can see why he's not very impressed with, I guess, the American Revolution in terms of its revolutionary nature, because he kind of goes on to detail why he doesn't think it's a radical achievement for democracy, even though to some extent there are unique things about the American Revolution that set it up to be, I guess, studied in a way that is more compelling than other states or countries over the last few hundred years. So he does raise some points on that front, right? Because he brings up how some of the roots and the arguments that went into the foundations of the government, but then he's kind of saying a lot of the fundamental tenets of this Constitution, or the ideas argued that are built into the Constitution, are about limiting the power of democracy, which is anti-democratic, and which is just kind of funny because the average person probably thinks we're like the most democratic nation to ever exist. So that's kind of something that Chomsky is kind of pulling at as he talks, and that kind of flows into the point you're mentioning, where it's like elites versus elites is really what we overthrew the British elites because we wanted our American elites. And one thing that I guess I'm prone to say things that are pretty radical, and one of the reasons why I'm not impressed by the revolutionaries against the British is one of their rallying cries is no taxation without representation. And I'm kind of like sitting here like, representation is not an excuse for taxation, right? But but I think that argument goes to the point of they wanted representation, but they didn't. But having representation isn't really democracy. It's like it's a level separate from democracy, right? Like a representative democracy, and they end up getting actually further from that. So they're chanting no taxation without representation because they don't like the British elites. They're essentially saying we don't want to be taxed by people we didn't vote to tax us, right? And then they were just replacing with American elites that tax them instead. But it was more popular taxes, or it was more democratic taxes potentially. So that's how you can argue it wasn't particularly revolutionary, even though we did have a war on our soil that we did, and we defended against the British. So that is worth recognizing, and it's kind of interesting. You want to bounce off that a little bit?
So I understand, of course, from I guess your perspective, given your opinion on a few key issues, that you would look at the American Revolution through a very specific lens, in the sense that these people were not interested in dismantling the state. As you said, they were not interested in abolishing taxes or getting rid of taxation. They didn't think taxation was theft, in other words. They, of course, depending on the president you talk about, some of them would have been protectionist. I think John Adams was protectionist, if I remember correctly, and I know you're anti, or you're for free trade and against anything that stifles free trade. And I guess from my specific perspective, I think the American Revolution was, I mean, and Chomsky brings this up in his lecture as well. There really aren't like there wasn't an aristocracy in the United States. There wasn't a king, so there wasn't royalty. It was much more the whole system, which has gotten increasingly democratic over the years and wasn't particularly democratic in the 18th century, 18th, early 19th century, although it was probably more democratic than most states that had come before it. It got away from a lot of European ideas, stuff that Europe was or is stuck with. So it's like, in England, they still have a monarchy, and there are people in England, in Britain, who call themselves Republicans, which is different from Republicans here, because the Republicans in England say, no, we want to get rid of the king, or queen in this case. We want to get rid of the royal family, or the royal family's posts in the government. So, and what the founding fathers really did at some level was they allowed, it was in some sense a bit more of a meritocracy. Again, that's it's a bit complicated, and it wasn't exactly a meritocracy in the sense that people like Adams and Jefferson and Madison, they were the educated elites. That they were the people with the most privilege and money and prestige and power. They weren't the common man. It wasn't as if George Washington was just a humble boy from the sticks that somehow became the ruler of a country. But the system in place that put people in power was not one of heredity and not one of tradition. It was something distinct from that. And I suppose I think that is an important achievement. Whatever the founding fathers' hypocrisies and whatever their flaws, because that's kind of what we've come to expect nowadays. You don't run into too many people who say, "Oh, I want a monarchy." Now on the internet, you run into a few people because you run into all kinds of people on the internet. But most people would say, "Yeah, our elected leaders shouldn't just get the job because their father had the job. They should get the job because they have abilities or because people voted for them." So I don't know. I just have a very my thoughts on the American Revolution are very complicated, and it's very because at some level I think it's very there's like two sides to it, and there was obviously disagreement among the founding fathers. If you read which I haven't, but if from what I understand, if you read the debates of the constitutional conventions, people were disagreeing about all kinds of things. In fact, the funny thing, I'll say this, so then you can jump in, and then perhaps we should move on to other things. But Thomas Paine, another founding father, he wanted the government to just give people land. He wanted much more, perhaps you could say, socialistic reforms, or reforms which ro- which bettered the material conditions of someone of the average person, and if ultimately his ideas were rejected, but it's that there was an aspect of the American Revolution which was, or at least could have been, very revolutionary. So it's admirable that those ideas were there. Of course, it's not admirable that they weren't put into place. And so at the end of the day, I guess at some level, the issues we find ourselves dealing with today do go back to the founding fathers. Now we've had a couple hundred years of history in between then, so there's a lot of other factors involved. But I do think it's important when we think about American politics to go back to the founding, mostly because we are a pretty young country, relatively speaking. I mean, Great Britain, I think, as we know it today, or England as we know it today, came about in the 10th century, and our country was founded in the 18th. So it puts looking at the founding fathers of the United States of America, it just puts things in perspective, in my opinion.
So one of the things that, I guess there's two things I think get glossed over a lot, and I know neither of us are experts, but it's just more kind of food for thought, is and we've talked about a lot recently how I often take the position of being skeptical of any constructed narrative. So anything that's summarized about history, I'm immediately deeply skeptical of. And one of the things that's very clear is when they teach you in, high school or elementary school about U.S. history, they try to paint certain ethics or certain values for certain periods of time, as if the people of certain periods of time weren't vigorously disagreeing with each other at all times. And you have to remember, around the time of the American founding, that was some of the most cutthroat and disgusting internal politics you'll ever see, because people were writing with the new innovation of the printing press. Everybody was printing pamphlets under pseudonyms, slinging ad hominem attacks that were they're absolutely disgusting at each other. So although a lot of these people have philosophies that we can see the roots of tracing back to some things people argue today, they were also not really our betters to the extent that they're painted to be. They'll have things that are insightful to say, but that doesn't mean they're talking at a much elevated discourse above what we're doing now. The other thing is that also points to how there isn't really good consensus between the founding fathers. The Federalists, the Anti-Federalists, they had all kinds of arguments on all kinds of issues. They had some agreements, but a lot of issues that were knockout, drag-out debates for the first 100 years of the country, like the national bank, stuff like that isn't really taught. It's more of yeah, there was stuff about a bank. I don't really know what was going on, but Hamilton really didn't agree with the other people. And then Hamilton got to do it, and then Andrew Jackson undid it. And everybody hates Andrew Jackson because he's also a racist that hated Indians. And he did something about the National Bank. But then they don't really talk about that. And that was actually a huge thing with Andrew Jackson, and that was part of like his populist appeal. And if you learn stuff about the Federal Reserve, you end up indirectly learning a lot about like the National Bank, right? But it's not something that's really caught in that narrative of history, even though it's like this huge debate point early on in American history. The other thing I just wanted to add on is just so it's the idea that there are all these people who drastically disagree that get lumped together, and then it's that people start with the Constitution instead of the Articles of Confederation. And the fact that the Articles of Confederation was a thing that existed, and the only thing people learn about in history is you like get taught like, yes, the Articles of Confederation didn't work because they weren't for big enough government. That's all you learn. You hear there was one rebellion, and they couldn't use the power under the Articles of Confederation to stunt that rebellion easily enough. So they decided they needed something bigger, and then we got the Constitution Convention. So I don't think that's very accurate from what I've read, and I think there's a lot more to it. So I guess I'd just say a lot of what you're taught probably has a lot of narrative implications that have some hints of truth, but you shouldn't necessarily overread into it. And there was a lot of disagreements at the time, just like there are now. We aren't uniquely polarized in the sense that I think the reason why we feel uniquely polarized is because the access to information is so much easier and faster. So you and I can find out stuff about all the way across the country that's a culture war issue in like half a second. But back then it was like you had to be a person who knew how to read, which was way less common. And then you had to go buy a little pamphlet. And then you had to actually under a pseudonym flinging trash at the other person and calling them names. So to actually be a polarized person, you also had to be like a property owner to vote and all these things. So it's just less common. But so I guess I'm just wanted to debunk some common American history things I just like to bring up. But yeah, well, I'm sure we're going to hit more on the democratic sentiment and stuff. And I am just going to say this to be provocative now, but I would probably argue that if I had to pick a system, I'd pick monarchy probably over democracy. And I think there's good reasons to do so. But I know that anybody who likes democracy just can't even wrap their head around it. So I like to say that to be provocative because a lot of people have their instincts in line with democracy. So I just want to throw that out there too. So yeah, well, but don't let me derail this because I don't want to pull us down too many tangents. You can go ahead.
So perhaps this would be a good time then to talk more about like I guess that's what Chomsky refers to as Madisonian democracy, and then I can give kind of my general thoughts on that. You can, and we'll try to get into some more some non-historical I guess points on this matter on the issue of democracy and the founding fathers version of it and whatnot. But I'll just say quickly, I think I agree with everything you said about the way American history is taught in schools and the way they gloss over all these different the disagreement and the mudslinging and all these various things. It's important to remember that the founding fathers were not deities. They were not perfect beings that were just creating the perfect system. They were human, and they had the same flaws that everyone alive now does. They just happened to be alive in a place and time which allowed them to found their own country. Not something most of us are able to do. But anyway, so what Chomsky's main point about American democracy is that it was designed to protect the rich or the property classes against the poor. And apparently Madison, warned that this system, or he was worried about like the increase in democracy. He thought, or he was concerned that democracy will, or there is a threat that democracy will creep into the system. So at some level, he was creating a system which was anti-democratic by its very nature, because as I guess as Madison saw it, or he talks about rights of property, which Chomsky thinks is a misleading statement. I don't particularly find that a misleading statement myself, but it's an important thing to bring up, of course, because that was at some level the founding fathers, what they were trying to do was they were solidifying power, or they were coming to power, and then they had to solidify it. They were men of property, and they wanted to create a system which allowed men of property to continue to stay in power. I think this is a fair assessment of what the founding fathers were trying to do at the end of the day, because to tie it back into another point Chomsky makes, honestly, I would agree with pretty much most of what Chomsky says in the lecture, or I agree with his overall thesis. And I thought it was interesting that he brought up, Aristotle, or he brought Aristotle in the conversation, and he's like critiquing, or he's contrasting Aristotle and Madison. He's saying that Madison and Aristotle were facing the same problem. How do you, or what do you do with the possibility that the poor majority will vote to take away, the rights or the property of the minority? And what Aristotle basically said was, well, you create a welfare state. You create, let me see if I can find the quote here. Something about allowing the greatest prosperity for all. I don't have it off the top of my head, but Aristotle thought that you give everyone the basic essentials, and then you won't have a revolution on your hands. But Aristotle or Madison thought that no, we don't give people the basic essentials to prevent a revolution. What we do is just create a system where it's the average guy. It's very hard for the average guy to take power, and I think that's an astute analysis of the way our country is, the way our country was founded, and the way our country developed. Because kind of what I was hinting at earlier, basically the more revolutionary aspects of the revolution, putting kind of the ideas and the symbolism aside, those ideas were crushed, leaving really a revolution of the business classes. And as far as I'm concerned, the business class are our masters. So I think this is a good time to let my co-host respond to some of that.
Yeah, so this is what I was talking about earlier when I kind of say that Chomsky is, I guess, in a way, frustrating. And it's so he kind of, every way that he frames an issue, I find incorrect, because he starts from root assumptions and intuitions that I either find baseless or I have like no sympathy towards that position. And I know his views are widely shared, his intuitions are, but he makes no he makes no pretense out of, like, I guess, establishing that his framework is something that is actually worth using. So he just talks from his framework, and then everything he says, I kind of think has no value to some extent. So I guess the way to put that in a nicer way is everything he says is so rooted in certain things he finds truths, but in his lectures he doesn't usually explain why he thinks that's a truth. Sometimes he'll explain why he dismisses criticisms, but he never explains like how he gets his root principles. So I don't sympathize with his root principles at all. So everything he's saying, I'm kind of like, okay, I don't care, because you're arguing for something bad, and you're saying that this thing doesn't work for something you like that I think is evil. So a lot of Chomsky, I'm listening to him talk, and he's quoting things and he's bringing up historical things that are very possibly accurate, right? So there's something, and this is something I just want to mention, just because it's kind of like a minor pet peeve with Chomsky, is he does this thing where he likes to and he very well could be right, in terms of like factually, right? He implies like everybody in the mainstream interprets Adam Smith incorrectly, and they interpret Alex de Tocqueville incorrectly, because what they do is they read certain quotes in a certain context, but what they don't realize is 200 pages later, Adam Smith says a thing that's, it more in line with somebody like Chomsky's sympathies about class warfare. And he's like, if you actually read Adam Smith, he's actually very anti-capitalist class, but people take a few things he says to be true and they ignore his anti-capitalist thing. And now I'm going to use the stuff nobody talks about to say why I should be right. And I find this very not satisfying because even if he's correct in interpreting Adam Smith's work in like the true correct way, it doesn't matter because the people who are arguing that are alluding to a certain part of Adam Smith's work, it doesn't mean that part is wrong or that part is right. Like it's not mutually exclusive. So it's almost like he alludes to these famous people and tells you a secret thing that you didn't know about him to make a point. And it is just like it's like an odd anecdote appeal that I just find like obnoxious. So he does that several times, but I don't want to get carried away down that road. Okay, so I guess where to start is his conception of property rights and why he thinks property rights are invalid. And I think this is interesting to talk about because I could see where he could have a point, but I think he only has a point if somebody's making a really bad argument. And so he's critiquing Madison's view of property rights. And Chomsky essentially formulates Madison's argument for property rights as invalid because the property rights that Madison talks about are exclusionary in the sense that he would say you have a property right to a piece of land, but well, if you Matt if you have a right to a piece of land, that means I can't have a right to that piece of land. So it's not really a right if only you have it and I don't have it. And so I'm going to preface this by saying I'm not a scholar of Madison, and Chomsky goes out of his way to clarify all these things he cited in Madison. That could very well be Madison's conception of property rights. But most people, when they talk about property rights, would not make that argument in that way that Chomsky is essentially dismissing. So I'm like, this isn't helpful. You're essentially dismissing a very bad argument for property rights. The better arguments for property rights are kind of indirect property rights. So the reason we have rights to property is because you have rights to your own autonomy. And when you have rights to your own autonomy combined with a right to associate with other people freely, you end up interacting in commerce and labor. And then it logically follows that you have the rights to the fruits of your own labor. And then usually the fruits of your own labor ends up being things like personal property or property and things of the sort. So I would say like the reason I have the rights to my own income and why I think taxation is theft is because I have my individual sovereignty inherently. And then with my individual sovereignty, I choose to associate with somebody, do work, but then the government comes and steals the fruits of my labor, which is like a right as a result of my sovereignty. Chomsky essentially just jumps to, you're saying you have a right to property, but how can you have a right to property if somebody else can't have that same right to that thing? And it's like, well, you're skipping the steps that get there. So that could very well be Madison's argument for property rights, but I guess what I'm saying is it's a weak argument. So Chomsky's, by talking about Madisonian democracy, he may be making a very valid point in the historical context, but it's not a very valuable point if you're actually trying to think about rights, because that's a very weak argument compared to, I guess, like a more steelman position that I hear more often. So I found that kind of frustrating because I kind of thought he was getting somewhere interesting. So yeah, do you want to say something about that before we move on?
Before I address your main point, I found the quote I was looking for. So Aristotle somewhere says that democracy, quote, or must, quote, provide lasting prosperity for all by distribution of public revenues. And I think that quote kind of gets into part of my response to what you're saying, in the sense that I think the issue with like a Madisonian conception of private property, and especially the issue with corporatism, which aren't the same thing, of course. Madison was pre-capitalist, or at least pre-capitalist in the way that we think about capitalism. But I think the issue with the way we think of property and the rights related to it does boil down to a situation where people are a situation where there are people out there that have absolutely nothing, that they're just struggling to survive, basically. Um, I mean, I guess one way to put it would be the Bernie Sanders talking point of, massive income inequality, um, in the sense that uh, to we live in a world where you have to have uh, you have to have money and you have to have access to various things, in order to um, live a fairly healthy, happy life. Um, and I think Chomsky's point is that, what someone like Madison doesn't really understand, or isn't really grasping, is you're depriving people of um, healthy, happy lives, um, when you um, are focusing on keeping in power a property class and making sure that property class keeps its property, um, while you leave the average person out to their own devices, and it doesn't matter what, at some level their life matters less to you, or this that matters less to the system than, an average person matters less to American democracy than a John Madison, because John Madison has property and money and influence that the average person in his time, or even today, just doesn't. Um, and this kind of goes back to another, I guess, the historical point Chomsky makes about certain pre-capitalist values, which are, again, go back to certain Enlightenment philosophers and aspects of Enlightenment thought, and then thought values post-capitalism, or during values during capitalism. Chomsky makes the point, and I'm not sure this is a very constructive point to make. I guess I see what he's getting at. He says something about, even slave societies thought that the slaves had a right to live. Under capitalism, you're not thought of as the right to live, or it's your right to live is come under question. Now, I'm not sure it's helpful to compare. I'm not sure the comparison's helpful, but I think his point is well taken, in the sense that, like, well, people say you got to earn a living. It's like, okay, so you're telling me I have to earn money just to exist? Um, so, and again, this goes back to intuitions, as you say, which aren't necessarily provable by science or math or whatever. But that would be my response, really. I think a lot of people's conception of property rights, um, it does leave people out to the point of deprivation, and that's the real issue, I think.
So I think what you just said kind of like reminded me why I kind of hate Chomsky a little bit, because I just find it like so. I almost find it very anti-intellectual in the disguise of being intellectual. Because it takes this root intuition that it's like, well, if we have a lot of something, people shouldn't just die on the streets, right? And it's like everybody goes, yeah. But then he conflates it by starting to use language like, so then you start talking about rights. And then when you start talking about rights, then you open up this whole can of worms of what do you mean when you talk about rights? And like what happens when you have a right that infers obligations on other people, and then what kind of other people have these obligations inferred on them because of rights. So then it's like, it's almost like he takes this intuition that we all have, like, yeah, it'd be great if people weren't dying in the street. And then it's like, okay, well, that means there has to be a right, because that's the only way we can say that's bad, is if we, make it a right for some reason. I just don't get how it gets to that's bad, therefore it's a right. It just seems like it's like he's working backwards in a way that I kind of find anti-intellectual, because I think if you're talking about rights, this is why I start from the individual sovereignty, is because it seems like the only reasonable starting point to me, because you can't just work backwards from where you want it to end up. You have to start from like, well, if we're going to treat people as humans and individuals, what core things do we have to treat people with? And then it ends up being like, if we don't want to take advantage of people, and we don't want to, almost got to take into account like some Kantian principles and think we can't just use people as ends. We can't just steal from them. We have to treat them as people who can freely associate and all these things. That's how I come up with rights. But it's almost like he takes his base intuition and is like, we should work backwards. So you know what? Capitalism doesn't give this right, but I'll give it to them because that's the nice thing to do. And now we can talk about why capitalism is evil because it doesn't grant this right. And then I'm thinking like, okay, well, he gave this example about why property rights are kind of not well reasoned because they're exclusionary. And how do you really have these rights work out where it's exclusionary? But can't you say the same thing about food or anything that is potentially finite? So it's like, well, how can you have a right to live if a right to living requires food and shelter, but food and shelter are finite? And then you have to say like, okay, well, everybody has a right to exist, but if you're in a situation where there's not a lot of food, then everybody's rights are in conflict, just like how he said there's an issue with property rights because they're exclusionary. So I kind of don't get how he defines rights in really any way that is helpful. And that's why it's kind of like it seems like he just has this intuition that is reasonable, but then for some reason he tries to intellectualize it in a way I find like annoying because I just don't think he's coming to a good point. He's just kind of like saying something that it's easy to agree with, but he doesn't really reason around it in a way that I find remotely compelling. Because all the things that I assume he would say are rights, like to be taken care of, or like in terms of medicine, like if you get hurt, and all these things that are compassionate, they all infer obligations, but obligations involve scarcity because people have to take care of you. And if a lot of people were sick, like if there was a pandemic in the 1800s, it's like, well, how many people are out there to take care of you and stuff like that. So it's like, well, how do you negotiate them? And if you have to negotiate them actively by putting obligations on other people, are they really rights? So that's where I start like kind of not really following him in terms of his intellectual thinking, even though I understand the intuition and the compassion he's trying to bring to the conversation.
I think this now we're kind of treading some, or now we're walking down, paths we've already walked down, in the sense that now we're kind of talking about like individualism versus collectivism. We're talking about social contract theory. Um, I think Chomsky would say, and I think it's reasonable to say this, and the there are the how would I put it? The community, I guess, exists, and the community is made up of individuals, of course, but the question, I guess, comes into, do we have responsibilities to try to help the people within our community, like from a moral perspective, or is it more kind of just let people do their own thing and it all works out in the end?
Well, I think you could very well say that you should and you are responsible, but I think you can say all that without saying this is a right. And that's where I'm just like, I feel like he's just saying words that sound good and he's not trying to support them. He's just like, here's my intuition, and I'm gonna say things that support my. I'm gonna talk about things that happen to coincide with my intuition, but I'm not gonna defend it. So that's why I was just so frustrated by it.
Well, again, this is going to be, you and I have just a different conceptualization of, I guess, what it means to have a right, or what rights are in the first place. You take food. Food was the example you used. I mean, the way I almost think about it is it's not an all or nothing scenario, in the sense that, like, we could feed the entire planet. Every single person on the planet could be fed right now. It's not a situation where, you could say it's somewhat. You could say scarcity is always, at some level, that there's always there's always scarcity to a degree. But I don't think we're in a scenario. I don't think we're in a situation where, like, oh, there's just not enough food to go around. So at some level, I think some of these things boil down to, it's not even scarcity, it's poor management. It's the inability to properly distribute resources. But, on the other hand, or to add to my point, I do have a hard time, I guess, kind of conceptualizing your your ideas on rights. I guess just because, I don't know. I don't see like property as something more valuable than, say, healthcare. I to I mean, we can have a conversation about property rights, and maybe property rights. Maybe you need to have some kind of property rights in society, but there's also things beyond property, and there's so many things beyond property. In fact, that that's why I'm willing to call them rights, because there's other aspects of society, of human existence, that go far beyond, I'm going to go buy this piece of land, and if you come on my piece of land without my permission, I'm going to shoot you. There comes a time when, like, I have a burst appendix. What's going to happen to me? I have to have care, or I'm going to die. Um, and we already treat that. We already treat that basically. I mean, well, I don't want to go into a thing about universal health care, but or I don't want to get sidetracked by the healthcare debate. But I think people have to have a certain standard of living in order for in order to have a bunch of self-actualized individuals, or at least try to allow the individual the opportunity to self-actualize. And in terms of like obligations on other people, I mean, I think this is why repeating things like collectivism and individualism, I think I do have obligations to other people at some level, and they have obligations to me. That doesn't mean I'm less free. It means I'm a human being and they're human beings, and I'm existing with them in a city or a state or a country or the planet. And it's kind of a fact of life at the level of kind of what needs to get done if you want to have a certain kind of life, or at certain level of life. If you want to allow certain things, or if you want to have the most pleasant things in life, you have to kind of you have to help people to an extent.
Okay, so my takeaway from what you said is there's like three things I want to follow up on. So the first thing is on scarcity. So the issue with scarcity isn't that we don't have like an abundance of some things. Like we clearly have an abundance of like books, in terms of like we don't need books to survive literally. Like we don't need them to, survive another day. If all my books got burned tomorrow, I wouldn't die. But the whole idea of scarcity is like, if we're talking about, say, food, well, we could ramp up our food production, 1,000-fold over the next 2 years if we wanted to. But it's because we'd have to re-leverage human capital, and then we'd have to re-leverage all kinds of resources that go into the back end of producing food. So even when you're saying, well, we have plenty of food to feed everybody, it's because we allocate a certain amount of human resources, which are limited and scarce, because we can do all the other kinds of things with human resources. Now, it's easy for us to say things like, well, we don't think humans should be, fighting each other in the war. So obviously, if we could just re-centrally plan them to be distributing food, that would be better, or something along those lines. But that it's really just, this is why I kind of had a problem with this one video I don't know if we ended up actually discussing it or if we just thought about it, but it was a professor essentially saying we don't have scarcity anymore because we have all this food. You go to the supermarket, there's food everywhere. And it's like, well, no, because everything that goes into the food is scarce in the sense that they could be doing other things, and we choose to allocate it to food through market signals. So that was just the thing I want to touch on scarcity, because there's essentially two definitions you can use. You can use a technical definition, which I'm using, or you can say something like very, I guess, literal and almost nominal, but I think it misses the point that everything we have, we can trade off for something else. And this is kind of like, this was a joke. Oh, this is something I kind of say to socialist leaning people when I'm in person, just to kind of mess with them, or just because I want to hear if there's a good answer for it. I always say, like, if you have a society that doesn't have like money and jobs, but you have a lot of resources, I always say, like, how do you figure out how many cars you should make and how many laptops you should make? And I think that's just like a fun question to ask, because it's like, well, how would you figure out how many people prioritize a car more than a laptop, given the amount of inputs that go into a car and a laptop? And the way we do that right now is like, if I could get a car for free, and if the government said anybody wants a car, raise your hand so we can count of how many cars to make, I'd raise my hand. But I'm not going to buy a car because in terms of how much it actually costs when I have to actually pay for the inputs, it's not actually worth it, and it's not worth upkeeping. So this is just something about market signals, and I think it kind of gets on the scarcity thing. It's like, well, we could have abundant cars for everybody if we wanted to, but we'd have a trade-off that's either in some other type of thing. So it's not real abundance, it's like fake abundance, because we could maximize anything if we wanted to. So I just think that's worth considering when we talk about things like food and healthcare. Okay, so then let's talk about property real quick. So I think you might interpret my definition of property a little too literal. So when I say property, I don't really mean like land. I really mean anything I choose to buy with the money I make. So anything I buy or purchase with the money I earn, because that's what I'm entitled to. So if I'm a sovereign individual and I freely associate with people, and then I put in labor and then get some sort of compensation for it, anything I buy I don't think should be infringed on. So that could be healthcare. I could have a right to healthcare when I'm buying healthcare, or I should have a right to donate to people if I want to help somebody. Like I have the right to do anything I want with the things I've accrued based on my own labor. So, I mean, it's easy to say property because that's like kind of the historical term or almost like a philosophical term because the money is your property too. And the money is kind of like liquid. It's whatever you want to buy with it. But I think all those things you have a right to when it's from the roots of your own labor. But if it's not from the roots of your own labor, then you have to compel somebody to give it to you. And once you're compelling it to people, then you're putting this positive obligation on them. And if you ask people about all different kinds of positive obligations, everybody's going to give you a different barometer. It's not like remotely objective by any degree. If you ask people, people will shrug. And the reason why I find it such an issue is because I think I do agree with Chomsky's problem about exclusionary rights. And I think the exclusionary rights issue he brings up is what applies to things like healthcare and applies to things like food. And I like to imagine like, okay, well, if everybody has a right to food, but we end up in a situation where food is incredibly scarce because whatever event happens leaves us without much food and we're all rationing and like we're down to the last piece of bread. It's like, well, who gets to say they have the right to the last piece of bread? Well, we're all supposed to be entitled to things that meet our needs, but there isn't enough stuff to meet our needs. So the right is clearly bounded by the reality we live in, and we made up the right to meet the fact that we have general abundance right now. But if all of us were near the brink of starvation, we wouldn't even conceptualize having a right to it because it wouldn't be something as easily imaginable. We wouldn't say you should have a right to safety if, you know, every year somebody died from a bear killing you because we all lived in caves and there were bears around. But now we can say, well, you could have a right to safety because we live in places that are relatively safe compared to that. So it's something that's clearly like drawn based on our reality now after the fact, as opposed to something that is came up with like inherently based on humans, which is why I have a problem with it brought up as like some sort of philosophical objective thing. It's more of like, I have a feeling that this is what a good, secure life looks like. So I think people should be compelled to meet my definition of a subjective, good, secure life. And a lot of people can agree on the subjective definition, but it's still something that you've like decided on and then called it right now. So then you do whatever leverages of power to meet it. And it's like, I can say that's admirable. I just feel like it's being dressed up as something far more philosophical once you use the language of rights, as opposed to things that are like inherently human. Because you can't have the inherent human right to, you know, the necessities if the necessities don't really exist and like 1 out of 4 people don't live past the age of 10 because bears kill them, right? And that's how what life was like not that long ago, right? So how could you argue that those rights are inherently human if those things didn't even exist to give people those rights to like the last couple hundred years? So it just seems, that's why it seems so off to me. Now, I don't think that resonates with you for whatever reason, and that's fine, and we can talk about that. But that's where I think the big gap is between us.
Yeah, what's your argument? If I followed it correctly, it doesn't resonate with me, in the sense that I think I could say the exact same thing about property. I mean, you could say the same. You could say it. You can make the argument that rights are just these abstract things that they don't have a bearing on reality. They're not objective. They're just they're just a subjective assessment of, I like having food, so I'm going to say I have a right to have food. Or I don't like my cave being invaded by another caveman, so I'm going to say I have a right to this cave. So I don't I don't think you like I'm at some level it doesn't even matter to me. Like you're saying, oh, it's not actually rights don't reflect reality; they're just subjective evaluations. I mean, we can have a conversation about that, but at the some level, I think that's irrelevant because I think that includes property rights. There's no objective. There's nothing inherently in the universe that says, oh, humans have property rights. We just as a society, we've said, oh, people have property rights. My brother bought me this microphone for Christmas, and my society deems that I now own this microphone. I have a right to this microphone. It doesn't mean like I, I don't have to be making some like scientific statement and say, there's the universe is constructed in such a way as to, you know, as to it's constructed in such a way that I have a right inherently to this microphone. I just live in a society that says I have a right to this microphone. Um, Go ahead.
Okay, I think there are two ways to proceed. I think I can attempt to make progress on this point, or we can decide it's a lost cause and move on. I think I can try to break it down in a way that we can maybe make progress, or at least understand, or at least have me maybe communicate why we disagree better. So yeah, it's your choice. We can move on if you want, though.
Well, I just have a quick thing to say about another point you made,
Okay.
and then we can circle back to this if you want to, and you can respond to both of my points. Um, I guess part of what I'm trying to communicate in this podcast, and I think you're also trying to communicate this. We're just communicating it from different standing points or with different worldviews in mind. But like the system we have in place, political and economic, it doesn't have to be the way it is. We for various reasons, it has what Chomsky calls, and I'm willing to call corporatism, and of course with a corporatism and plus neoliberalism, that's kind of what we have here. We don't have to be in a society that's run by corporatism and neoliberalism. And my issue with corporatism, neoliberalism, and capitalism is it goes back to the fact that we are, the people in power basically are more concerned with putting money in their investors' pockets, putting money in the pockets of the people who funded their campaigns and said, well, I'll give you, I'll cut you $1 million check if you vote this, this, and this. They're more concerned with helping those people than they are with you and I. And, we can talk all day long about, whether I have a right to health care or to a gun or, whether abortion is a murder or not. Like we can have these these conversations on social issues, but at the end of the day, people are running out the back door with buckets of cash, and the rest of us are left waiting for the inevitable collapse of, well, okay, let me not, I shouldn't put it like I shouldn't be apocalyptic about it, but we are I mean, the way I see it, it's just it is a system which is benefiting corporations. It is benefiting the super wealthy. It is benefiting, of course, the politicians that are putting money in the pocket of the rich, of the super wealthy, and the corporations. It is benefiting a very small group of people, and it's not benefiting the rest of us. And I know you would say, okay, that's not real capitalism. Like, fine, that's another conversation we can have at another time when we've had those similar conversations. But I actually think it is real capitalism. I just think it's a form of capitalism, just like, Stalinism is a form of socialism, or Marxism, or perhaps better to say Marxism, Leninism is a form of socialism. So yeah, what I'm trying to communicate, I guess, is just that we cannot put money before people. We cannot put corporations before people. We have to start, when we're thinking about the kind of society we want to live in, we really have to start from a certain level of compassion and a certain level of human understanding. Because I guess to really hammer this home, Chomsky brings up the corporate law and how corporations at some level are people in our system, and that's exactly backwards, because corporations are made of people. Corporations themselves are just these abstract. Corporations at some level don't even exist. They're a collection of. I mean, they exist. They exist within the parameter of the economy, but they're not. They're not people. They're not these immortal human beings or immortal entities that have legal rights. The people working in the corporations have legal rights, and the people within people who work for and run corporations are allowed to do certain things and are not allowed to do other things based on how we deem how we square certain issues about rights and property and whatnot. But the people come first. That's the bottom line. People come first, and we don't live in a system where people come first. And that's really my issue with neoliberalism and corporatism and capitalism. And I don't have all the answers, and I'm not here to say I can paint the perfect utopia, the perfect post-capitalist utopia, because I can't, and nobody can. So I'm not going to sit here and say I exactly know what we need to do to fix everything, but I do know the system we have currently is inhumane and probably unstable. That was kind of a mouthful. So you can respond to whatever you want, or and leave other things aside. I know you wanted to talk perhaps a little bit about rights. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I do think if anybody didn't feel like watching the whole Chomsky video, you pretty much did a 4-minute summary of his lecture right there, which is admirable in the sense that it was like you nailed it. But I have all the takeaways of like, oh yeah, thank you for reminding me of everything that I just didn't resonate with, like on all the random things. So I'm kind of just like, okay, where do I start? Because I know whatever I start with, we're just gonna go to town on for 10 minutes. Now, I mean, I guess the reason why I don't dismiss it out of hand is in the sense that I start from the same root of it needs to be human centric. But the problem is I start from the human centric in the singular form, because I don't think I don't share any of the collectivist intuitions that anybody like Chomsky shares. And I think that leads to a lot of my disagreements with the rest of his analysis that you kindly essentially laid out just now. So like, for example, I would say that the reason, like if we were going to go back to the rights conversation, which I'll only touch on, the reason I get to my point, it's not about the property. The reason why I'm such an ardent defender of the property is because the property comes from the labor, and the labor comes from valuing the individual as a sovereign that has the rights to himself. And if he himself decides to do something like rent out his labor, that is him, as a sovereign acting, and we should respect that. And I think that is a very human-centric view, is a person can choose what they do with their time and choose to pursue what they want through freedom of association with other free people. And then they can prosper as a result, or, do whatever as a result. It doesn't matter. So I think that's the human-centric way to look at it. Now, Chomsky would say he wants to be human-centric, which means we need to democratize everything, right? And we need to give everybody access to all kinds of things that Chomsky has laid out as things he deems necessities. And I just don't resonate with that at all. And I don't think that's human-centric, because I think you have to use other people as ends to get to what Chomsky wants. And I think that's where it starts violating human autonomy, because then he's starting to say like, okay, well, we need everybody to have access to these certain things. So that means I'm going to put obligations on people. And I'm like, well, that's not very human centric. So now I'm not here to say that Chomsky's corporatism critiques are wrong, because why would I defend that? I'm as disgusted by corporatism as I am disgusted by Chomsky, right? I think they're both villains and evil and deserve to be pushed up against the wall, to steal a phrase. And I really do mean it when I say that. I'm definitely Fed posting because Chomsky is still alive, so that's a threat. Um, but okay, sorry. I've not slept a lot. I warned Matt that, so I warned him I'd go off the rails, and that's where I did it. But if threatening Chomsky is what does it, I'm okay with it. Okay, so to tie back in, okay, so I squared away that part, but that's also a rehash of the individual rights argument. We already did that. We weren't swayed. So I'm just going to cut you off and say you don't get to rebut that because you already did rebut it twice, and we'd just be going on the hamster wheel. Okay, so I get really thrown for a loop, and this is the part that we're going to have intuitions that differ, and I want to bring it up because somebody out there's got to agree with me. So Chomsky's talking about corporations, right? And he's saying, like, you imagine a company, and it should be a bunch of people work at the company, and a bunch of people prosper because the company is doing well. So all these people, in some sense, are owners of the company because they all benefit from the company's success. But then he's like, but you know what we do? We do this disgusting thing that is corporations. And now the corporation is treated as a person, but it's not run by people anymore and people don't own it. But then he's like, but the shareholders own it. Or it's not just the shareholders, but it's also the board of directors own it. And I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, I feel like Chomsky is playing word games in a way that I find not satisfying. And the reason why is when you work for a company and the company does well, you get paid because you work for money. So no matter whether you literally own a share in the company or not, which you're generally free to buy if it's a company on the stock market, you could buy shares of it if you felt like it, but you are generally benefiting from the company doing well because the company doesn't go out of business. Then he decides that corporations shouldn't have rights that people have, even though it's made up by people, because it's made up by a board of directors. But boards of directors, although they are rich people, and as I have learned from the people who protest outside of Jeff Bezos' house, that he should be guillotined and the rich aren't real people. But as far as I'm concerned, the board of directors are still people, even though they're generally wealthy people. So I don't have this issue with corporations being treated as people because I don't see why you would limit a corporation just because it's a corporation. So I guess the example I'd give is like you and I, to some extent, have the right to peacefully assemble or freedom of speech or something. So to abridge those rights for a company seems weird to me if the company has those decisions made by people, because you're just indirectly limiting those people's rights. You're saying, yeah, you guys have the right to speak, except for when 4 of you agree on one unified message in the form of your company. And it's like, I feel like you're limiting individuals then, but Chomsky hand waves it by just calling them a board of directors. And I think they're still people. You can't have a corporation that literally has no people in it. So I'm kind of thrown by that, and he really leans into that a lot, and this is a very common message you see after everything about what was it, after the McCain-Feingold litigation in the Supreme Court. You hear this a lot, like, I can't believe Republicans think corporations are people. And I just have never seen a corporation exist that doesn't have people in it. So, and I'm not saying this just to be a jerk, but I'm saying this because I really mean it. I don't understand how you limit corporations without limiting the individuals within the corporations, because now they can't act in the same free way they could if they were just at home, because now they're at work. And that seems completely arbitrary to me. And it seems like a consequentialist thing. And if you want to say it's a consequentialist thing because you don't like the outcomes of it, that's fine. But they act like, I can't believe that on a serious, like, theoretical level, how can corporations be people? I think it's that simple. It's because people make it up. So do you want to defend Chomsky's perspective on that? Because I know you're more likely to be in line with him than I am.
I guess I'll defend it by basically just telling, if anyone's curious and they haven't heard the Chomsky lecture, I'm basically just saying Chomsky's points slightly in a slightly different way, because I'm not Chomsky, I'm Matthew. But the issue, I guess, in terms of like corporations as people, and just the issue with the system we have now, is it's comparable to fascism and Bolshevism. Chomsky brings up how Rosa Luxemburg and then the early Trotsky, before he, jumped in the rowboat, was they were saying, this is what's going to happen in the Soviet Union, guys. the people are going to be controlled by the party, and the party is going to be controlled by a central committee, and the central committee is going to be controlled by one man. Meaning, it's a pyramid with someone at the top controlling everybody, below him or her. This is, it's going to lead to basically another czar in Russia, Joseph Stalin. um, so basically, I guess what Chomsky's trying to get at is our system gives corporations and the super wealthy the most influence over everything and everyone. At some level, it's a new and improved aristocracy or royalty at some level. The difference is it's not hereditary necessarily. Well, wealth can be hereditary, but it doesn't go back to, some guy conquered this area and he was king and therefore all his descendants are royalty. But of course this goes back to democracy, in the sense that people don't have control over people don't have as much control over the economy as perhaps they could or should. But regardless, I don't think the point can be I don't think you can underestimate how much control the business class has in this country and in the world. So Chomsky brings up how in 1890 corporations controlled 3/4 of the country's wealth. 3/4. And I don't know how much it is in 2020. 1890 was a long time ago, of course. But if you're in a situation where corporations and the business class if that's what matters, then everyone else is going to suffer in some way, in some form of fashion, because what's important is making money, making as much money as possible, doing whatever, and making as much money as possible, and investing, and making this, make sure the stock market pulling strings in certain ways, so certain people get, profit a lot from the stock market or whatever. I don't know much about the stock market. That's beside the point. Well, I'll just wrap up by saying that this is why I think Chomsky would say, and this is why I would say, democracy is so important, because what democracy does better than any other system, and I'd be curious to hear your defense of monarchy, but maybe we can have that conversation another day. But the best thing about democracy is it allows for the largest number of people to have a say in the economy and in law and politics, in any, just in what it means to the average person can have a say in their society. And I think if we accept that everybody has some value or some worth, then I think we have to say, okay, then we have to allow you some representation, some voice, and the system that prefers or corporations and the business class just doesn't give you that.
Gotcha.
That was a bit of a rant, so sorry.
Yeah, you're good. I'm just having so many thoughts right now that are like eight levels deep, and I'm not even sure if I can phrase them in a way that could actually communicate the way I'm thinking about them. So that's why I'm thinking carefully. So one takeaway I had though there is, even if you argue about essentially that companies control a bunch of wealth because they can get out of hand because of the corporate structure, that's not an a priori reason on why corporations made up of people shouldn't have rights. It doesn't lose its humanity. And I guess that was my critique of Chomsky. I didn't want to push back on any consequentialist ground he'd make, because he'd have an argument that I could push back on it, but I'm more comfortable with the a priori reason of you don't escape that corporations are still made up of people no matter how big they get. And even if it's a board of directors you don't like, and even if they're driven maliciously, it's like you still want to hold back somebody's rights. And he seems to shy away from that in a way that I find a little disingenuous. Um, but it's a very common thing, and that's why I was wondering if he had a unique standpoint beyond that. Now, when it comes to his consequentialist grounds, I kind of really push back on the idea that okay, so imagine you live in a world and businesses own 3/4 of the wealth. What does that mean to you as one person? It could mean very well nothing. You know why? Because just because you say businesses as a sector own 3/4 of wealth, it's like, well, what does that really mean? Well, it depends how many businesses are out there. One thing that I think plays a lot into Chomsky's appeal towards the demographic he appeals to is he really leans into the idea that people are slaves to their employer. But to operate in that existence, you have to accept two things. And it's kind of like, one, you have to accept the mindset of a person who does not have many skills. So it's typically people that are like college aged or people who are low income workers. And like, you can feel sympathy towards them. I'm not telling you not to. I'm just saying those are the people his argument's most relevant to. And then you have to think of as if you live in some sort of I think the economic phrase for it is a monopsony, which is like the idea of like there's one coal mine for a town, so you are really the slave because your whole family lives in that town. You don't want to move, and you're qualified to be a coal miner, and you're not that skilled anyways. So you're kind of at the mercy of the coal mine in terms of employment and doing what they say. Now the thing is, like, I live in a big city. And even if I worked in retail, there are like 300 companies within like 2 miles of me that I could work for and I'd be qualified to work for. So as much as it's like a lot of these same rules abide place over place, and you do have to pick one, I think he paints it in a much more lopsided way than it is. Like, I personally see myself in a situation where I'm not the most skilled person because I'm under 25, right? But I could see myself picking up one certification, and then all of a sudden I have all the leverage in my workplace because they'll know that I could leave for a job that pays 20% more in like 4 months if I look for one, right? So there are ways that these relationships aren't as simple as Chomsky kind of makes out to be. And he would acknowledge that I'm making a point and it doesn't invalidate his theory. I'm just saying it's way easier to bind to Chomsky's theory when you're not thinking about it in this incredibly multi-layered thing from worker to worker, from company to company, from region to region. And that's where I think he starts to fall apart, because I think the gravitas of his argument falls apart once you really break down how dynamic our labor and capital market really is. And that's why I'm not very sympathetic towards his arguments. And then that's before I even get into my critique of what he is calling for, which is more democracy, which I don't think is any better than what we really have. So I think he kind of overstates the problem by giving examples that have a hint of truth, but aren't necessarily even the norm. It just applies to a very large set of people that we should be sympathetic towards, but that doesn't make it the norm or the standard or even super commonplace. It's commonplace for a certain demographic, which is like low skill people. So you have thoughts on that before I go into my last critiques and we wrap up?
Well, let me try to quickly, since I didn't quite answer your question about corporations as people, let me attempt to give a bit of a better answer. I'll make one more point and we can try to wrap up. Or you can give your final critique and we can try to wrap up. So I think what Chomsky really is saying here is almost different. He's not even quite saying corporations are people. He's saying corporations are above people, in the sense that, in making sure the company has as much leverage in the market as possible becomes priority number one. And it's not hard to see how toes can be stepped on and regulations can be violated and all these things, but you can find the proper loopholes, hire the proper lawyers and fill out the paperwork. It's all good. So that's really, I think, the point to be taken away is, corporations don't get special treatment, or they shouldn't get special treatment. And I just don't understand. So it can, like, okay, out of freedom of speech, I would put that like aside as to like, oh, should corporations have freedom of speech? It's like, no. I mean, corporations, people who work in corporations are going to say whatever they want. I don't care. But corporations are not the same thing as the people who work for them. I mean, you can distinguish the two at some level, I think. I mean, you can't have, how would I put it? So it just goes back to, I guess, what I was saying before in that the individuals who work for the company are really what's going, like, they're the ones that have the rights, I think, because as far as for my philosophical or based on my, I guess, worldview, people are the foundation of rights or whatever, or people, living beings are kind of what it is. You have to be like a living being at some level to have a right. Corporations are just entities, economic entities,
Yeah,
abstract entities that people can create, but they're not the same thing as people, because a corporation isn't alive. A corporation is just a collection of individuals saying, we're gonna we're gonna give people this service or do this in the market, and but again, it goes back to, it's the people, not the corporation.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, right? I'm saying the same thing. I'm saying it's the people. So the second you put the restriction on the corporation, you're saying the people can't do that in a context of their life. So the second you put a restriction on what the corporation can do, now those people can't do it. So that's why I'm saying it's like, I'm saying I don't buy the a priori argument, because it's like, well, if you wanted to restrict, say, a company's right to talk on something, well, you're really restricting all the people that work at the company when they're in a context of their life, right? So now all those people don't have rights in a whole portion of their life. And you could easily argue that they don't want to exercise them,
you'd
right?
have to give me, oh, sorry.
You could easily argue like, oh, well, those people don't really even exercise freedom of speech in the context of their life. But in reality, the company wouldn't exist without the people in it. So the second you say this company can't do X and Y, you're saying, well, these people aren't allowed to do it when they're working for the company. But that's a huge part of people's lives, right? That's 40 to 60 hours of their week is work in that company. So if you like pass a law that says service workers, and I know nobody would pass this law, but if you say service workers aren't allowed to say more than 3 words to a customer unless they're spoken to first, right? Then you'd be like, well, I mean, you're putting this regulation on the company, but it's all the people in the company who now aren't allowed to talk because of the government's rule. And then you'd be like, well, that's an infringement on the people. And it's like, well, no, it's a business regulation against a certain industry of companies and how the people behave in the context of the company. And you go like, well, yeah, but that's an infringement on those people doing something in the context of their work. And like internal regulations that a company sets on itself are different because that's a contract, right? So as you make a contract with a company and you already agree to act in certain ways for the company. And you agree with that. I'm talking about like governments coming in overhead and saying, well, you can't act in this sort of way at a company for whatever reason. And it's like, well, the rule abides to the people. So you're infringing on the people that are at the company, not just the company. You can't have one without the other. I agree with you, right?
But in response, I could just say, a complete platitude, but it's true. You can't do anything. You can't be allowed to do just anything in the context of business, in the context of earning money. Like nobody, not even anarcho-capitalists, think anything goes.
Well, so that's what I'm saying. It would be the same limitations for both. It'd be the same for both.
In terms of when you're talking about like, oh, well, if you infringe the corporation's rights, you're infringing on people's rights. Well, then it gets back to, well, of course, what are we defining as a right? But still, like business regulations, I know the business, well, let me finish. The business regulations exist. Well, I guess there are multiple reasons they exist. They exist partly to benefit. Well, okay, I mean, there's so many things to talk about here. There's there's business ethics, or like there's ethical restrictions that we have on corporations, which is, of course, a limit on what the individuals of the corporations do. But that's just, I mean, that's both a fact of just, kind of how business relations work out, and it's also a matter of like ethics and morality. But so like I don't really understand, or I don't agree with the way you're conceptualizing it, I guess, in the sense that a lot of what the regulations that I'm fighting for in terms of what corporations are not allowed to do, it does not come from what it does not, it's not infringing on what I view as rights or,
Yeah, I know. That's the point
and
I'm trying to make. That's the point I'm trying to make. I'm trying to make the point of, can you tell me a right that you think is okay to infringe on corporations that you don't think is okay to use on individuals? So I guess the example is you're saying like, well, there's some things companies shouldn't be allowed to do. And I'm like, yeah, like murder, right? A company shouldn't be allowed to murder, but individuals shouldn't be allowed to murder either. So it's like, okay, like companies shouldn't be allowed to pollute rivers. And it's like, neither should individuals. So I guess what I'm saying is all the things that are reasonable regulations on companies aren't infringements uniquely on the individuals because they're things that aren't infringing individuals' rights, right? So like a company can't pollute rivers that they don't own, just like an individual can't pollute rivers they can't own. So that's why I'm saying like then the second I don't understand where all of a sudden something's okay for a company to and not for the individual. It seems like all the obvious things are like, well, yeah, but a normal person can't do it either, right? So like, can you give me an example of a regulation you think doesn't infringe a company's rights, but would infringe an individual's rights? But it doesn't infringe the individual's rights anymore because they're in the company. Because that's what the debate's about. So the debate's about like freedom of speech, right?
I'm very confused. Let me try to figure out where we are in this conversation. So what are we disagreeing on then? You're disagreeing, or we're disagreeing on whether. Okay, I know. Okay, well, I know we're disagreeing, or I know we began by disagreeing on whether corporations are people. So are you making the argument that, or are you making the argument that we need to, if we're going to say, I just need you to explain yourself, sir.
I got you.
You're confusing me.
So I'm saying a corporation should have rights like a person because corporations are made up of people, right? So we got that far to where that's my argument. And then what I'm proposing to you is I'm saying, okay, you disagree that corporations aren't people, so they should be able to have their rights infringed in ways that people's rights aren't normally allowed to be infringed on. So, and then you started saying like, okay, well, there are obviously things companies shouldn't be allowed to do in pursuit of profits. So I'm thinking in my head like, okay, well, obviously there are some things companies shouldn't be allowed to do, but it's not a thing that a person would have the right to do. So like no person has the right to like murder somebody. So it's like, of course, if you say, well, a company can't murder, it's like, well, yeah, but you're not infringing on the people at the company's rights because those people never had the right to murder. So then it's like, okay, well, the company can't pollute a river. It's like, well, the people never had the right to pollute a river that wasn't theirs. So I guess what I'm saying is I need an example of a regulation that is acceptable because companies don't have rights, but it would infringe people's rights if it was only on them. That's what I'm looking for. So I'm looking for the one that fits the whole scenario of because corporations don't have rights, we can do this policy, but if corporations were treated like people, we couldn't have this policy. That's what I'm asking for.
So I'm thinking off the top of my head here. Maybe a week from now, I'll have like the perfect answer. But I guess the way I kind of conceptualize this is if a corporation if a corporation is doing things that are harming harming people, harming a community, harming the surrounding environment, if they are if they're cutting corners and they're not doing enough to abide by basic human decency, then the government, or well, rather the community, but in our context, I suppose more the government, has a right to say, stop it. You can't do that.
But
If
they'd
you
be
keep
allowed
on
to do that
doing
to
that, if you keep on
individuals
doing
too,
that,
right?
hold on. If you
But we'd
keep
be
on
okay with that
no,
to individuals. So it's the same thing.
If the corporation has the right, the government has the right to say when corporation, I'll finish and then I'll let you respond. If the corporation's doing anything to harm the environment, individuals, the government, again, which is technically, in my conceptualization, an extension of the community, although it's fudgeable or it's more complex than that. The government has the right to say, you have to stop doing that. You have to stop polluting the river. You have to stop selling this product, which is harming people. You have to stop. You have to stop doing this, that, or the other thing, or we're going to shut you down. You may ask your question now.
Okay, so I that was the example I gave of what doesn't fit what I was asking, right? Because a person doesn't have the right to pollute a river. So if you say, well, the government should be allowed to stop the corporation, well, it's like, okay, of course they should, because the individual never had the right to it in the first place. Chomsky's whole argument is corporations should have less rights than people. So, and then I was arguing, well, so I'm saying if corporations have less rights than individuals, then what things are you prohibiting them from doing that individuals, it would infringe an individual's right if you tried to apply it to them. And then if you say pollution, it's like, well, individuals aren't allowed to pollute. If you say murder, it's like individuals aren't allowed to murder. So
corporations get away with
I'm not saying they don't.
Not do.
I'm not saying I don't. That's not what I'm arguing about. That's not what we're talking about.
It's relevant though in the sense.
No, it is, but it's not what we're talking about.
Hold on.
It's like if I started talking about monarchy again out of nowhere. It's like, yeah, I get how that's tangentially related, but that's not the discussion point.
No, but I think it is relevant in the sense that if you take a look at the third world, one reason the third world is such a mess is because corporations are allowed to do things which, if they did here, it would be a scandal. But they're allowed to do it in the third world because, we don't care about those people. Those people don't matter. Let the corporation come in and just.
But if one person was doing it, then the government would be allowed to stop them. Just like if the government was benevolent and not evil, it could also stop those corporations, and we'd be fine with it because nobody has rights that are associated with those heinous actions, which is why it wasn't relevant to my question. And where I was trying to get you in this conversation, what was saying corporations shouldn't be allowed to give money to elections, because that's the talking point that Chomsky goes to, and that's kind of a talking point I'd expect you to go to. And then the point I was going to get to was, even if you imagine a board of directors, if you think those board of directors should be allowed to do what they want with their money, and they all own a large portion of the company, and they can vote on what the company does with money, then you do have to infringe on those people's rights to make decisions with things they own the rights to, or they have the privileges of. And you have to go, no, you individuals aren't allowed to do this with your corporate power because we don't like that you have power. And it's not an a priori decision, it's a consequentialist decision. And this is my problem with Chomsky, is he says a lot of things that are just idealist, and he frames them in philosophical terms as if they come from a priori arguments based on a chain of reason. And it's more of just this thing is bad, so we should just limit this. And it's not actually principled. And that's fine, but he doesn't frame it in such a way. You have to do the work to kind of figure it out. That's where I was trying to get that conversation going. It's that's really the only place where corporations have rights that he wants to take away that an individual would have ultimate rights of, in terms of, I guess, Chomsky's thinking. That's where I was trying to get us, and I guess clearly we weren't going to get there. I understand the point you were making about how, yeah, Chomsky does talk about how companies get away with all kinds of heinous stuff because governments don't care. I agree. Governments are evil. Governments don't protect anybody's rights, and they let companies abuse the crap out of people who are poor and can't defend themselves. That's because the government does. That's because the government gives them the privileges, and they usually give them subsidies to do it. I think that's a case for government not working, which is where me and Chomsky agree. So it's yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. That is worth mentioning, but I wanted to get that other point out there first. Sorry for getting a little tilted. I reiterate, I have not slept a lot, so I'm a little irritable. Okay, you get the last say on this topic. I think if I get some editorial insight, there's 4 rapid fire thoughts I just want to say, and I don't even want to try to sound that biased on them. I just want to say the thought. And if you want, you can respond to them, but it's more of just food for thought on the Chomsky topic for anybody who's listening to think about. And then we can wrap up because we've been going long and I have no idea when we started recording.
So I'm just making a very specific point, and I guess my point could be summed up as my definition of person is much more limited than yours is, because it a table isn't a person, a chair isn't a person, uh, a corporation isn't a person,
Is a
a
team of
publishing
people?
house isn't a person.
Okay.
A
If
board of
if five people write a paper together, a book together, is that not a person writing a book? It's five people, so now it's an organization. So you can censor it if you want to.
no,
I'm
organizations
just
or
curious.
publishing houses or corporations, that they are
So if human capital is separate,
they are distinct
if human
from
capital
the
is
people.
separate, it's a person. But if you put more than one piece of human capital together, it loses the rights.
No, I'm just look like
I'm being provocative on purpose.
It's like voting. Macy's doesn't get to vote in the election. Macy's doesn't get to
But all the people who work at Macy's get to vote.
Yeah, but Macy's itself doesn't get to vote.
Yeah, but if the people had to vote through Macy's, you would let them, right? Like if they weren't allowed to vote otherwise.
I'm confused.
I feel like that's a better analogy.
My point
that
is
doesn't make
that
sense.
My point is that it's in my conceptualization of things, people have rights, and groups of people aren't a person. Groups of people are a group of people. And again, it's like, sure, if you're in a publishing house, if you're in an organization, if you're in a corporation, you have rights. And as your business people, you could say business people have rights. I'm not against business necessarily. It's like, yeah, you have people within a business can do this, that, or the other thing within reason. As a community, we have to decide what business practices we allow and what we won't allow. But the corporation itself is an abstract entity put together by or created by a group of people. It exists on the market. It exists in the economic sense, but it doesn't exist otherwise. And it shouldn't necessarily exist in the political sense. You brought up the, I guess what is called campaign finance reform, or how, a corporation can give $1 billion to a presidential candidate and that's legal. That's actually a good example. I wish I'd come up with it myself. That is something I would not allow. I wouldn't allow people to do that, or corporations actually, just because I don't think money should be in politics the way it is. But so
okay. I think I agree with you, because like at Temple University, I just doxed myself if anybody's curious.
A university isn't a person either, by the way.
No. But on this public property, there's this guy who'd always come with a megaphone, and he's alone, and he would preach, and I'm okay with that. But those protesters for Black Lives Matter, the government should have shot all of them because there was 10 of them. You know what I mean? I think we're on the same page. No, we got too far into the conversation, so I had to be funny and lighten the mood by making a joke about killing protesters in the United States. Okay, I decided that we were done because we were beating a dead horse, and I don't usually do that, but this is an episode where we yell at each other and we're having fun. So I hope you're having fun, because I'm having fun as much as I think I needed this because we didn't record last week. Okay, the last few thoughts I wanted to bring up, and these are me trying to get out thoughts in 2 sentences, and I'm just gonna throw a flurry of them out there. So the reason, as we have alluded to, I'm against democracy is just because democracy.
Well, I have an idea.
Okay.
Rapid fire, like questions or something, or like you just give me a sentence and I'll respond to it.
I say like 2 sentences and you get like 5 words. How about that?
Okay.
I think democracy is bad because you're still being ruled over. I don't care if it's 1 person or 1,000 people. The majority is just as bad.
Do I get more than 5 words?
Nope. You get 5 words. This is the rapid fire part. You could just be like, "That's dumb. 7. I hate you." You can say that.
Okay. I am for democracy in the sense that.
Okay, so that he's for democracy. Okay, so then the reason why I'm pro monarchy is because at least if they're fascist, instead of it being everybody, you just hate all the other citizens. At least you hate the king, and you can go and kill the king if you can get like 2% of the people to agree with you.
I'm not doing the 5-word thing, but
Oh,
anyway.
okay, you're done. Okay. Okay, so I had those thoughts. Oh God, I
So no,
had
I can
one.
respond. I'm just not
Oh,
doing it in 5
okay.
words.
These are rapid fire. So if you're not gonna respect the format, I'm just gonna keep going. Um, let's see. The last thought was just Oh God, okay. I had like 2 more and I lost them. So you know what? On that note of just laughing and being completely mentally drained after we only rehashed some arguments. We kind of touched on somewhat new stuff. So if you're a longtime listener, I hope you're rewarded by finding like one new piece of content in this hour and a half argument. But I hope you guys enjoyed us going back and forth. I'm sure we're gonna have more discussions like this, and we always manage to turn an hour and a half lecture that seems somewhat mundane to some extent into us almost shouting at each other, and me saying that he's essentially arguing that protesters should get shot in the streets, even though that's clearly not what he's arguing. It's my due diligence to mischaracterize him. I'm also glad I got to essentially say that Noam Chomsky should be killed, which is kind of messed up because he's like 93. But I said it, and I said what I said.
I must insert here, ladies and gentlemen, no Noam Chomskys were harmed in the making of this podcast.
Yeah, not yet. No, I could. Yeah, I'm a madman at this point. Who cares? So if you guys want to check out our backlog, you can go on YouTube, type in Beyond Talking Points. I think if you just Google Beyond Talking Points, you should be able to find our lovely faces. I think we've done enough podcasts to finally start tracking for those probably low-ranking keywords. So you can find us that way. You can find us on all your podcasters. I've been absolutely abysmal on updating that just because we had a few technical issues on the old way we used to record. This is some inside baseball stuff. I'm just going to complain real quick. And we did one episode where it was like 4 parts, but then there were other glitches in the parts. And then I'm like, dude, this is a long podcast on somewhat, actually, I'm not going to say outdated because then people might not listen to it, but it was some very early coronavirus arguments. So at some point, there's just going to be like 15 episodes dropping that feed. No, it's going to be like more like 8, but that's going to happen. So hopefully you guys will catch up and stay tuned in. But right now it's mostly all on YouTube. You can see our lovely faces and you can see us arguing with each other and getting very, very heated to say the least, especially depending on the discourse.
And you can see that I look a bit more professional than I used to. I used to have an old gamer microphone, and now I have something that resembles a normal person's microphone. So.
Yeah, and I actually trimmed up my beard, so I look slightly less homeless than probably the last 3 or 4 videos. So at least there's that. But I hope you guys enjoyed. We'll be sure to argue about some other stuff soon. We have a couple other things that we've thought about checking out, and certainly the political discourse right now may be getting more heated as we're recording on the day that people invaded the Capitol. So we might talk about some current events, possibly. So on that note, I hope you guys enjoyed, and we'll talk to you guys next time. So signing off. It's Matt and Matt.